The next day was 20th of July. Hitler was expecting Mussolini in the early afternoon, and the situation conference had been brought forward half an hour to 12:30. It was a warm summer's day, and those of us attending the conference assembled before the barracks hut. This circle included Puttkamer, Bodenschatz, and Graf von Stauffenberg, who since 1st of July had been Chief of Staff to General Oberst Fromm, C&C Reserve Army, and had attended at the Berghof a few days previously to present a report. Hitler wanted to explore the idea of new panzer and infantry formations, and today's conference was to receive information on the possibilities. Hitler welcomed with a handshake each officer standing before the barracks before leading the way at once into the situation room, where other senior officers were assembled. Amongst these were Keitel with his ADC John von Freyend, Jodl together with Major Bux, his Luftwaffe General Staff Officer, and Oberstleutnant Weisenegger, First General Staff Officer, Korten, Bühly, Chief of the OKW Army Staff, Schmundt, Heusinger, Warlimont, Fegelein, Voss, Oberst Brandt, First General Staff Officer, Kapitän José Assmann, First Admiral Staff Officer, Scherf, Envoy Sandleithner, Borgmann, Gönsche, and two male stenographers, Berger and Buchholz. The conference opened as usual with Heusinger's report on the Eastern Front. I was standing a little to the side, discussing the agenda for Mussolini's visit with the three other adjutants. Heusinger made a point which interested me, and I moved to the opposite side of the table to obtain a better view of the map. I had been there for a few minutes when the bomb exploded. The clock said 12:40. I lost consciousness for a few seconds. When I came to, I saw around me a ruin of wood and glass. I staggered to my feet, got out through one of the window frames, then sprinted around the hut to the main door. My head was buzzing. I had been deafened, and I was bleeding from the head and neck. At the door, a terrible scene greeted me. Severely injured officers lay around on the floor. Others were reeling around and falling over. Hitler, sure-footed and erect, was led out by Keitel. His uniform jacket and trousers were torn, but otherwise he seemed none the worse. He retired at once to his bunker for medical attention. 11 persons were found to have serious injuries and were taken to the military hospital 4 kilometers distant. Everybody else had injuries in some degree, the majority with perforated eardrums. I ran to the neighbouring signals barracks and passed orders to the duty officer, Oberstleutnant Sander, to block all outgoing signals except those from Hitler, Keitel and Jodl. Next, I went to the Führer bunker, where I found Hitler sitting in his study. As I entered, I saw that he had the facial expression of a person who has faced death and come through it almost unscathed. He asked after my injuries and said that we had all had enormous luck. The conversation turned to the incident. Hitler dismissed any idea that Tot organization workers, who had been refurbishing the barracks a few days previously, might have been responsible. By now, Graf Stauffenberg had been missed, and a search was made. It emerged that shortly after the beginning of the situation conference, he had slipped out to the annex on the pretense of having to make a telephone call. Without waiting for the connection to be set up, he said he had forgotten his map case, and returned to a car in which Oberleutnant von Haften, his orderly officer, was waiting. The SS FHQ commandant had meanwhile raised the alarm, and sentries had instructions to allow nobody to pass. Stauffenberg's car had arrived at the outer barrier, but could not go through until permission had been obtained by telephone from the commandant's adjutant. This officer knew Stauffenberg, had taken breakfast with him that morning, and assumed that Stauffenberg had to return to Berlin for service reasons. He saw no connection between Stauffenberg's hasty departure and the explosion. Thus, Stauffenberg had an open road to the airfield, from where he took off for Berlin aboard an She 111 of the Army Quartermaster General. As these details gradually became known, Stauffenberg's guilt was obvious. Himmler, now nominated C&C of the Reserve Army, received full powers for the criminal investigation, and after a short stop at Wolschanzer, flew to Berlin to be closer to events. It was not possible to form a clear picture by phone. The flight from Rastenburg to Rangsdorf took 2 hours, the drive to the Reich War Ministry about another hour. Thus, neither Himmler nor Stauffenberg could reach Bendlerstrasse until after 1600. This allowed us a few hours to get patched up, and I sought treatment from an army medical officer. Goering's personal physician also took an interest in me on my return, confirmed my concussion, and ordered me to bed. Goering even had an SS guard posted at my door to ensure that I did not attempt to get up. This was ridiculous, for I was the least badly hurt of the adjutants, being able to walk and fit for limited duties, for which Professor Brandt gave me permission during the course of the evening. This was necessary, for Hitler was very busy. After dinner and the evening conference, we talked. He told me that Schmundt and Borgmann were very seriously hurt while Puttkamer was confined to bed with a knee injury. This meant that I needed another aide, and I asked him if I could have Oberstleutnant von Amsberg to assist me. He had been Keitel's ADC and knew the ropes at FHQ. Hitler agreed at once. What most concerned him now was who should be chief of the Army General Staff. Zeitzler was on the sick list, and Hitler did not want to see him again. He was thinking of Guderian as his successor. I advised him against this appointment and suggested other candidates. I had in mind Bühler and Krebs, but Hitler settled for Guderian. Many more details came in that evening from Berlin. Goebbels had summoned Major Rehmer, commander of the Berlin Wacht Battalion, and set up a telephone conversation with Hitler in Rehmer's presence. Hitler told Rehmer to restore order by force of arms. Generaloberst Fromm, who had been replaced by Himmler as CNC Reserve Army, and whose stance was not unequivocal, had, after some vacillation, taken the initiative in the Bendlerstrasse. He had had the ringleaders arrested and shot. These were Stauffenberg and von Harften, General Ulbricht and his chief of staff, Ritter Merz von Quernheim. Generaloberst Beck was given the opportunity to take his own life. Hitler was extremely annoyed at these measures, and ordered immediately that those arrested were to be brought before the People's Court. That evening, after Mussolini's departure, Goebbels pressured Hitler into making a brief radio announcement. Goebbels said that there was great uncertainty amongst the people, which only a direct speech by Hitler could assuage. Hitler allowed himself to be persuaded and spoke that evening. He named the would-be assassins and said that a quite small clique of stupid officers, ambitious, unprincipled and criminal, had wanted to remove him. I interpret it as a confirmation of the intention of Providence, he said, that I shall continue to my goal as I have done previously. Late on 20th July, Hitler was obviously saddened to receive news of the death from his injuries of stenographer Berger. On the 22nd, General Korten, chief of the Luftwaffe General Staff, and Oberst Brandt of the General Staff also died. It was discovered that the latter had belonged to the resistance. A strange role was played by the head of Wehrmacht Army Signals Liaison Organization, General Feldgiebel. He remained at FHQ after the explosion, congratulated Hitler on his survival, and was arrested on 21st July as a member of the resistance. He was later executed. According to the medical staff, Schmundt was so seriously injured that even on the most favourable prognosis he would not be able to resume duty for several months. Hitler missed him sorely. General Bergdorf took charge of the Army Personnel Bureau and, in October, after Schmundt's death, became Wehrmacht adjutant. Hitler's condition was worse than at first thought. His hearing was damaged and he had recurrent pain in the arms and legs. The nerves of his left arm were damaged. Only his strong will and the heightened sense of mission kept him upright. Repeatedly at situation conferences he would speak in a sharp and coarse manner and make demands of the army and Luftwaffe, which were simply not possible. Hitler spent more time with me than usual discussing the rebuilding of the Luftwaffe. I was surprised that these conversations were quite normal, and no criticisms were levelled at absentees. I told him that only in the East did we have continuing prospects for success. In the West, in view of the enemy air superiority, we had few opportunities. He admitted that I was right, but insisted that he would never capitulate. Henceforth, events would determine that our opponents in the East, increasing in strength and fighting power, would soon be capable of making the strategic breakthrough there. Hitler responded by saying that the Soviets held us in such awe and respect that they would never dare to attempt it. This was true initially. A few days after the bomb plot, Goebbels came to FHQ for talks. It was his heartfelt desire that Hitler should order total war. Hitler agreed and nominated Goebbels Reichsplenipotentiary for total war, to which effect he signed an edict on 25th of July listing the plenipotentiary's most important duties. This edict did not really change anything, for we had already been engaged in total war for some time. All it did was weaken Speer's authority. At about this time, Richthofen came to FHQ to report himself fit for duty after a head operation. Hitler received him after the evening situation conference. Richthofen requested him to end the war. I gasped in horror. Hitler was not in the mood for talk of this nature. Yet, in this small circle, just the three of us, he was open and relaxed, and said he saw no prospect of obtaining an acceptable peace for Germany. The discussion rambled on about this and that for ages. Hitler respected Richthofen, who always knew the right way to put his ideas across without being presumptuous or subservient. Daily reports were received from Himmler's staff in Berlin about the progress of the investigation. Each contained fresh names of resistance conspirators. The list showed clearly that the resistance had its foundations in conservative circles. In fact, the nobility was so strongly represented that voices began to bay for action. Noisiest was party organisational leader Dr. Ley. After Hitler forbade him to speak publicly, things began to quieten down. The stream of reports which Fegelein laid before Hitler was unceasing. After a few weeks, when the investigation had more or less ground to a halt, the leading figures of the resistance were in custody, and the trials had begun before the People's Court. Hitler ordered an end to the flow of paper. The military situation compelled him to direct his attentions elsewhere. Fegelein's subsequent behaviour was repugnant. He was not merely content to present reports about the results of the trials, but took pleasure in passing round photographs of the executions. I refused to look at them. Hitler merely glanced at the prints reluctantly, in the same way that he would look at photos of bombed German cities. With him, it was simply a case that he shut his eyes to the consequences of his orders. I cannot recall a single visit to a burning city or a residential block reduced to rubble after an air raid. In exceptional cases, he would make a hospital visit. His main concern remained the bombing. He always came round to this, even in conversations with visitors. He still believed firmly in the completion of the jet aircraft and in using them operationally in northern France. He knew my opinion on this, but refused to admit it. He saw the Mini 262 as the last great chance to bring about the change in Germany's fortunes. The Russians had pushed on, and by the beginning of August they had taken Brest-Litovsk and Kovno. In the fighting of the next few weeks, Army Group North would be cut off. Shortly before the Russians reached Warsaw, there was an armed uprising by the Polish resistance. Himmler ordered it to be put down ruthlessly, and the SS did so, inflicting heavy casualties on the Poles. Farther south, the front had been forced back almost as far as the Hungarian frontier. In northern France, August brought fresh successes for the enemy. The American breakthrough at Avranches opened up all Brittany. Hitler ordered a counter-attack from east to west across the base of the Cotentin Peninsula. This made no tactical sense and in any case never got off the ground because of unopposed enemy air superiority. During these crises in early August, my headaches increased in severity and I collapsed. Bed rest was ordered. I managed to get Keitel to lend me his Luftwaffe adjutant, Major von Szymanski. This he did very grudgingly. Hitler agreed to this solution and let me rest. I kept to my bed at FHQ. I needed peace and quiet to allow the consequences of my concussion to heal. My recovery dragged on for almost a month. At the end of August, I was granted leave of convalescence. I have no clear recall of those 3 weeks in bed. Hitler himself remained upright only with effort, and what I learned from Szymanski and von Amsberg did little to help my recovery. On the occasions when I visited Hitler, I found him engrossed in planning a huge new offensive on the Western Front with freshly formed panzer and fighter units. I asked him why he did not concentrate all his forces against the Russians and received the answer that he could attack them later, provided that the Americans were not in Berlin. First of all, he must have space on his western border. I did not understand his thinking, and I doubt whether anybody else in Germany could have either. Everybody thought it was preferable to allow the Americans to take the Reich so that the Russians could be held off as far as possible from the eastern frontier. Hitler did not share this view because he feared the power of the American Jews more than the Bolshevists. On a visit to my bedside, Hitler spoke to me about Goering's faults. He would not let Goering fall, however. His achievements were unique, and it might be that he would need him again one day. It was clear to him that Goering had failed with the Luftwaffe, not least because of his idleness and partiality towards old cronies. But when it really mattered, Hitler said he would want Goering at his side. He still had confidence in him. I replied that I was of a different opinion, but Hitler shook his head. The Luftwaffe had been given a new chief of general staff, who would soon set himself zealously to his task. There was much to do. I remained silent, for it was obviously impossible to convince Hitler to the contrary. The situation in the Luftwaffe was muddled, for there were actually two chiefs of the general staff. Kreiper, a crony of Goering, and Kohler, who was standing in for Korten. Amsberg and Szymanski came almost daily with tales of Hitler's gripes against the Luftwaffe. Meanwhile, the enemy was advancing calmly on the main fronts. I reported to Hitler on my departure at the end of August. He was in the rebuilt conference room in which the bomb had exploded 5 weeks previously. He stooped a little more than before the bomb plot. I had the impression that he was not yet fully recovered. He greeted me warmly and extended his wishes for a speedy recovery. Of military matters, he did not speak, except to hand me the special wound badge he had instituted for survivors of the bomb plot. It varied from the usual issue in that the steel helmet and swords were positioned higher to make space for the inscription 20th of July 1944 and his autograph. I took the night train to Berlin and went from there to my in-laws' estate at Halberstadt. Here I felt very low. A year previously my wife had taken the children and some of the furniture and moved in with her parents at Nienhagen to await the war's end. The attacks on Berlin were becoming worse. Our house had been the only one left standing in the street. The rest had either been reduced to rubble or burnt out. At Nienhagen, the war seemed far away, but an incident I remember well was of a heavy bomber formation crossing a marvellous blue autumn sky. Our fighters got in amongst them and scored heavily in the fine weather. A burning four-engined bomber spinning in flames from a heavenly blue sky made an eerie picture because the distance robbed it of sound. Hitler sent a handwritten note to my wife conveying his best wishes for my recovery. I was surprised that he could find the time to write. My wife replied with a letter of thanks. I interpreted the letter as a hint to resume duty as soon as I could. In mid-September, she drove me to the health spa at Salzbrunn in Silesia. Within 4 weeks, I had made a relatively rapid recovery. I had to take the cure and spent hours walking in the countryside. In Salzbrunn, it seemed like peacetime. Our hotel was reserved mainly for wounded soldiers, not least on account of our friendship with Karl Hanke, Gauleiter of Silesia in Breslau, whom we had befriended pre-war. We were well accommodated and cared for. He visited us several times at Salzbrunn and showed us round the district. This was of especial interest for me because of the construction of the FHQ near Waldenburg in Silesia. So far, other than the foundations, there was nothing to see. Little progress had been made at Schloss Fürstenstein either. I considered the work at this FHQ completely superfluous, and my first view of it told me I was correct. Later, I was given to understand that the work had been abandoned. Szymanski visited me twice at Salzbrunn. Both times he arrived weighed down with dreadful tidings, but he had a sense of humour and always managed to depart in high spirits. The Russians were at Goldap and closing in on East Prussia. FHQ would soon have to be evacuated. I told Szymanski that he should arrange to transfer to Zossen near Berlin all less important parts of FHQ. As for the air situation, there was hardly a battle-ready unit. The Luftwaffe was out of it. The hydrogen, rubber and ball-bearing centres had all been severely hit again. The USAAF was concentrating on destroying key industries. It was everywhere, a picture of catastrophe. Szymanski told me about Hitler's psychological condition. On 26 September, Himmler informed him about resistance activities in 1938 and 1939 by Canaris, Goerdeler, Oster, Donani and Beck. From this, it was clear that the attack dates for the Western campaign had been continually fed to the enemy. Other documents provided a history of the failed attempts to depose or assassinate Hitler. Hitler reacted to these reports with a breakdown in health. At the end of September, he complained of severe stomach and intestinal colic. Dr. Morell diagnosed a psychologically induced gallbladder condition. Hitler languished in bed for several days until resuming work, very slowly, at the beginning of October. Schmundt's death on the 1st of the month would have added to the shock. I knew that in recent months his most confidential conversations had been with Schmundt. Szymanski told me that at the end of September, Ritter von Greim had come to FHQ. Hitler wanted to make him C&C of the Luftwaffe, whilst allowing Göring to remain in the post nominally. In view of the hopeless military situation, I assumed that Greim had declined to work anywhere near Göring. As for Kreiper, who had recently been deposed, we assumed that party people had done the dirty work. Since the bomb plot, Fegelein had had Kreiper watched. Szymanski was visibly embittered when he brought me the news of Rommel's death, which was undoubtedly on Hitler's order. Rommel had been given the opportunity to commit suicide so that his family should not suffer. His membership of the resistance had been discovered. We thought it unlikely that he would have been a driving force. He had probably been lured in by his Chief of General Staff, Speidel. The only reasonably positive report was news of the first V2s on London at the beginning of September. A large number had gone astray, but many had caused serious damage. The British took a dim view of rocket attacks, and Hitler expected much from this weapon. Szymanski also reported on the abortive British parachute drop at Arnhem, on the fighting for Aachen, on the defection of Hungary, on the British landings in Greece and the capture of Athens, on the loss of Antwerp, and finally on the Polish uprising in Warsaw, which had been put down on 2nd October. Next he mentioned Hitler's plans for the Ardennes offensive with the objective of retaking Antwerp. I asked Szymanski why Hitler wanted to do that. Even if he succeeded, Antwerp was not the place from where to make a decisive stab anywhere. Szymanski replied that Hitler wanted to gain time for the completion of new weapons. I said which, but Szymanski did not know. In mid-October, I drove to Nienhagen to resume convalescence. On the 22nd, Puttkamer rang and asked me if I could possibly return. The Luftwaffe was subject number 1, and permanent discord had developed between Hitler and Göring. I told him I would set out next day. I did not really feel up to it, but it was obvious I had to help Hitler. Thus my convalescence came to an abrupt end. I arrived back to a transformed Wolfschanze in the morning of 24th October. The Führer bunker had become a colossus of concrete with walls 7 meters thick. 3 other bunkers had been similarly clad. The former wooden structures had 60 Siebst-Major concrete splinter protection. After being brought up to date generally, Puttkamer explained the worries being voiced by Hitler about the Luftwaffe. The negotiations with Greim about becoming Luftwaffe C&C were dragging on, and Puttkamer pressed me to obtain some kind of solution. In the Adjutant General, Burgdorf had taken over the Army Personnel Bureau, and become chief adjutant following Schmundt's demise. He had brought in a young front officer with the Knight's Cross, Major Johann Meyer, to assist. Amsberg and Szymanski had returned to normal duties, and after Christmas, Borgmann would step down as army adjutant. From the front, there was only unfavourable news. In East Prussia, the Russians were at Goldap. We had just won back Gumbinnen, where the Soviets had been raping and murdering the female population, and ransacking and then torching the houses. Chaos reigned in the streets. The OKH expected a Russian offensive in the southern sector of the front daily. Some German divisions had been partially wrested, but the substantial losses of panzers could not be made good. The Balkan Peninsula had been abandoned. German units were making an orderly retreat from Greece by way of Bulgaria and Romania and then through Yugoslavia. The Western Allies were advancing towards the whole western frontier. Hitler was preparing the Ardennes offensive for about 1st of December, provided there was no Allied offensive beforehand. The air situation was causing major concern. The USEF and RAF were treating Reich airspace as their own. Our air defence was insignificant. The Allied bombers were going for pinpoint targets such as oil refineries, aircraft works, rubber factories and supply organisations. Hitler's rage at the Luftwaffe was understandable, but the guilt lay not with the Luftwaffe itself. There was a whole string of causes, which began with the neglected armaments programme of 1940. Puttkamer mentioned that at the end of September, Hitler had agreed to Goebbels' demands for a Volkssturm. All Germans aged between 16 and 60 were eligible for call-up. The party centres were given responsibility for the force, but it lacked weapons and equipment. When I reported to Hitler at midday, he gave me a hearty welcome. He wanted to talk during the course of the evening. The working day began as usual with the situation conference, at which Guderian and Wenck were also present. Jodl made a statement about the preparations for the Ardennes offensive. As Hitler had ordered Kreiper not to appear again, the chief of the Luftwaffe General Staff, Christian, delivered the Luftwaffe report. Admiral Voss represented the Kriegsmarine. It was relatively quiet on both major fronts, and Hitler had had time to scheme the Ardennes offensive. Everything seemed to revolve around this operation. That evening I had the first of numerous conversations with Hitler, which began mostly in the hour before midnight, and lasted up to 90 minutes. Hitler was calm and businesslike. He had had a number of talks with Greim. Actually, he wanted to make him Luftwaffe C&C, without relieving Goering of his post. Greim had made a suggestion for a command structure which did not quite match his own ideas. Greim had maintained the dialogue, and both wanted to find a satisfactory solution. I asked Hitler if Goering knew anything about these discussions, and he said he supposed so. I told him I could not imagine that Goering would voluntarily resign his position, and added that I no longer believed a fundamental change in the Luftwaffe were possible. It was more or less wrecked. Factory airfields were coming under repeated air attack. The British seemed to know precisely when a batch of aircraft was due off the line. Then they would attack. It was my opinion that this could only be stopped if an RAF force were massacred on one of these pinpoint raids. At the moment, that was simply not possible. If one day we had the Me-262 as a fighter, then we might. Hitler got very annoyed at this and held forth about the skill of the jet fighter pilots. I told him we had to think in realities. Another evening Hitler spoke about the bomb plot and the subsequent trials. He said that Himmler's reports had caused his breakdown. No person could imagine what pain he had had to bear. Everything had been betrayed. The preparations for the French campaign, the dates of the attack, and the objectives of the first operations. Even the beginning of the Russian campaign had been betrayed. There was probably nothing more that remained a secret in Germany. Most sinister had been the work of Admiral Canaris. Goerdeler had been very much involved. He was the one who had confessed. He was talking his head off while Canaris was still denying everything. The mass of the arrested conspirators had become involved more or less incidentally, Hitler said. The number who were fully in the picture was quite small. General von Tresckow, for example, had had a hand in everything, and had committed suicide once he recognised soberly that the bomb plot had failed. I mentioned to Hitler the case of my cousin Boris and the supply problems of his corps in Kurland. He had just informed me that supply had been mysteriously restored following the failed bomb plot. Hitler admitted in a disheartened manner that so many conspirators came from the educated circles in which he had always more or less had blind faith. What pained and disgusted him was not that they had betrayed him, but Germany. I had known for some time, he said, that the better circles of our people were against me. But the trick in times of crisis is not to become fickle, and if that is achieved, you have a source of strength which can never dry up. Hitler mentioned the fighting on the fronts. The quiet situation on all fronts now showed that the enemy needed a breather. He was himself waiting for the moment when the Anglo-American coalition broke up. He could not imagine that the British would accept a permanent American presence in Europe. I replied that I differed. Churchill's politics proved that he stood shoulder to shoulder with the Americans. Anyway, the Americans were so strong in Europe now that they would suit themselves as to how things were done. Hitler did not respond to this. In the afternoon of 1st November, Hitler had a long private talk with Grime. When I asked Grime afterwards about the outcome, he said that, for the time being, nothing had changed. I was glad that this had been the decision. Although I could find much fault with Goering, a change of C&C at this time served little purpose. Hitler admitted that I was right, but said that a new chief of the Luftwaffe General Staff had to be appointed. I suggested General Koller, who as chief of the Luftwaffe Command Staff seemed to understand the problems. He had calm and poise too. This coincided with Goering's ideas, and so Koller became the last chief of the Luftwaffe General Staff. On 11th November, Goering convened an Areopag tribunal in the Luftkriegsakademie at Berlin-Gatow. General Peltz, a bomberman, had been selected to chair the meeting. Amongst those present were all the big fighter bomber names: Galland, Malzahn, Golob, Trautloft, Lützow, Steinhoff, Nordmann and Streib. And the bombermen Harlinghausen, Baumbach, Knemeyer, Storp, Diesing and others. An illustrious assembly. Goering opened the convention, saying that the Luftwaffe had failed, and we had to look at ourselves critically in order to turn the page. The rules of the tribunal were that he, Goering, must not be criticised, and the ME 262 had to be left out of the discussion. With these limitations, the Areopag was so much hot air, for these were two fundamental causes of all our misfortunes. Goering called upon those present to help him resurrect the Luftwaffe, then left. Peltz took over. I could not help thinking that Peltz had an unenviable task. He knew that an Areopag was a tribunal with unlimited powers, but Goering had set restrictions. In attempting to avoid that which could not be discussed, the discussion meandered down many blind alleys. The whole thing was a dreary forum, which harped on about the National Socialist influences within the Luftwaffe, especially amongst the pilots, and led to a conclusion which said nothing. The final protocol discussed between Hitler and Goering was no more inspired. The meeting broke up in dissatisfaction. It was stigmatic of a Luftwaffe in dissolution. Too little too late. The fighter pilots probably thought, as they climbed up into their cockpits. I returned to Wolfschanze in a state of depression. As so often in recent months, I wondered about Hitler and his purposes. How could we win the war with the forces we had distributed around Europe? Our hope was now a split in the enemy alliance, or, put simply, a miracle. The fighting strength of the Waffen-SS was substantially better than that of the army, but even they could not carry on without weapons and ammunition. I did not know whether Hitler understood the catastrophic situation in the army and Luftwaffe, or if he preferred to deceive himself. The planned Ardennes offensive seemed to me to be a sideshow that would succeed for as long as the winter conditions kept the enemy's aircraft on the ground. Hitler repeatedly emphasized the National Socialist spirit, which welded together the fighting forces. But in 1939, he had begun the war without speaking in that vein. Now he said that the British had to recognize the importance of his war against the Soviet Union. Yet, from the beginning, Britain had stood shoulder to shoulder with the Russians against us. The Americans knew only one enemy in this war: Germany. We were at the end of this great struggle, and there remained for Hitler only the question of his personal destiny. He mentioned the problem on numerous occasions. In the last days at Wolfschanze, between 16 and 28 November, I heard him speak about it. When Jodl suggested that FHQ be transferred to Berlin so as to be nearer the Ardennes, Hitler said that he would never leave East Prussia. The war was lost. He said this several times, but Bormann succeeded in convincing him. In the afternoon of 20th November, Hitler boarded his special train and left Wolfschanze forever. On 14th November, the British had attacked on the Meuse towards Roermond and Venlo in Holland, but without achieving a significant success. At the same time, the Americans had had little success in an attempted penetration deeper into the Reich further south. They had carried out air raids on towns in their intended field of advance, and Düren, near Aachen, Jülich and Heinsberg were completely destroyed. However, they made poor progress forward, being forced back between Düren and Jülich, and at Metz they encountered heavy resistance. Hitler looked on with a baleful eye. He was fearing for his Ardennes surprise. He had invested great hopes in this offensive and was already seeing in his mind's eye the German spearheads rolling into Antwerp. In East Prussia, German troops had had to cede more territory and had either withdrawn into the fortified area at Königsberg or been forced back to the Vistula. One of these armies was commanded by General Hossbach, who celebrated his 50th birthday on 21st November. Hitler sent him a check for 50,000 Reichsmarks as a gesture of confidence in his former adjutant. We arrived in Berlin on the 21st. Next day, Hitler had a small polyp on his vocal cords removed at the Charité Hospital by Professor von Eichen and was ordered not to speak for 7 days. On 28th November, the first US naval convoy docked at Antwerp, and from now on the Americans had no problems of supply. On 10th of December, we left Berlin, arriving early the next day at Ziegenberg near Bad Nauheim, where there was a fine old castle which Speer had had rebuilt and refurbished at the beginning of the war. Hitler had assured him then that he would never set foot in it, and instructed Speer to build barracks and bunkers in the nearby woods. We lodged in the latter, while C&C West and his staff were quartered in the Schloss. In the last 2 days of our stay, Hitler assembled the commanding generals and divisional commanders for the Ardennes campaign into 2 groups of about 20 persons each, and attempted to persuade them that the enemy coalition would soon break apart. He set all his hopes on it. He reminded them of how Frederick the Great, in the darkest hours of his war, had stood alone and triumphed. Then, as now, the enemy alliance would founder as a result of this imminent offensive. He demanded that the enemy be engaged to the end. If every man would only think of success, of victory, then we would not fail. With such words as these, Hitler attempted to unite the senior commanders. With an attack in a small area, using the last battle-worthy units still at his disposal, he seriously believed he could bring about the disintegration of the enemy alliance. I was appalled that this should be served up to the generals as a reasonable argument, for the enemy superiority was such that no enduring success was possible. The offensive began on 16th December. The weather was overcast and no enemy aircraft appeared until Christmas Eve. Dietrich's 6th SS Panzer Army and Manteufel's 5th Panzer Army were the mainstay of the attack, which was under the command of Model. Manteufel made good progress, and only Bastogne held out. Dietrich, battling further north, had to batter down more resistance and remained further back. On 24th of December, the weather cleared and enemy aircraft appeared. This ruled out any further movements by day. Some units were short of fuel. Shortly after Christmas, it became obvious that the adventure was fruitless. My fears were fully confirmed. Our offensive, with between 28 and 30 divisions, among them 12 panzer divisions, ground to a halt at Monschau-Echternach at the year's end. Our units had taken heavy punishment and were in no state for fresh operations. Even Hitler could not close his mind to this. One late evening I was with him in the air raid bunker. He appeared to me to be in despair. Never before or subsequently did I see him in such a state. He spoke of taking his life, for the last hope of achieving victory had gone. He reproached the Luftwaffe and the traitors in the army. He said something like, "I know the war is lost. The enemy superiority is too great. I have been betrayed. After 20th of July, everything came out, things I had considered impossible. It was precisely those circles against me who had profited most from National Socialism. I pampered and decorated them. And that was all the thanks I got. I ought to put a bullet in my head. I lacked hard fighters, Model and Dietrich are such. And Rudel, now there's a successor for me. Intelligent, what are his views on art and culture? He should come." He continued, "We will not capitulate ever. We may go down, but we will take the world down with us." I have never forgotten his words. I have never spoken to anybody about this conversation until now. It made it finally clear to me that Hitler would never seek to negotiate peace, and would rather drag everyone down in his defeat. The path had been laid. It led to that very unconditional surrender upon which the victors were insisting. On 29th of December, Hitler instituted the Knight's Cross with gold oak leaves, swords and diamonds. He stipulated in the deed that the decoration could only be awarded on 12 occasions. That day and the next, he spent time with General Tommele discussing political problems, the completion of the new panzers, and when the latter could be got to the front. Guderian followed next. He expected a new Russian offensive in the first days of January and wanted divisions withdrawn from the Ardennes to the Eastern Front. Yet Hitler vacillated. He approved the transfer of 4 divisions in Hungary to defend the Romanian oil fields, but that was all. Thus ended 1944 in a mood of hopelessness. The last prospects of a success of the Western Front had disappeared. New, difficult operations lay ahead in the east. Apart from the occasional local success, the Luftwaffe war effort was almost invisible. The Allies had almost total air supremacy. What Hitler really thought about the situation, nobody quite knew. Officially, he spoke only of continuing the battle in the hope that the enemy alliance would fall apart. What we were supposed to make of that, nobody knew. What we did know at FHQ was that of himself, Hitler neither could nor would take a step towards a solution. The year 1945 would bring an end to the war, but it was doubtful if we would be alive to see it. In his New Year speech to Wehrmacht and Volk, Hitler spoke openly about the war situation. He referred to the international plans to dismantle the German Reich. It remained only for the German people to put up a successful resistance to the attempts of our enemies to strangle us. He spoke of the attempt on his life, which was a turning point in German history. I was convinced that even in this quite hopeless situation, Hitler still had the confidence of a broad cross-section of the people, who simply would not believe that the Reich could be defeated under his leadership. Personally, after the autumn of 1944, I saw his death as the only way out. That he shared my opinion might be inferred from the suicidal thoughts he sometimes expressed. On the morning of 1st January, the Wehrmacht CNCs and the chiefs of the General Staff assembled at Führer headquarters to offer their best wishes for a successful New Year, a sentiment which I am sure they all expressed with their tongues in their cheeks. After the situation conference, Hitler invited Oberst Rudel into the circle of generals. He spoke a few words of recognition and praise for Rudel's selfless devotion to duty, presented him with the recently instituted highest award for bravery, and mentioned his unremitting and provenly highest heroism, his unique fighting success as aviator and warrior. What Hitler and Rudel discussed behind closed doors after the midday meal I was never able to discover. A catastrophe befell the Luftwaffe the same day. Goering had planned a strike by almost 1,000 aircraft on the western frontier against various ground targets. Preparations for Operation Bodenplatte were kept strictly secret. Nevertheless, the attack was greeted with heavy enemy anti-aircraft fire. On the way back, our aircraft flew over accurate German flak, the batteries not having been informed of the operation on the grounds of secrecy. We suffered heavy losses, which could not be made good. Bodenplatte was the last major operation undertaken by the Luftwaffe. On the occasion of his 52nd birthday, Goering called at FHQ on 12th of January to receive Hitler's warmest congratulations. That day, a massive Russian offensive began in the central sector of the Eastern Front. Behind heavy artillery fire, a large mass of tanks smashed through the German front line and headed for Upper Silesia and the Oder. The Red Army took Baranov on the first day and Kielce on the third. Hitler attempted vainly to close the breach by bringing up a corps from East Prussia. He realized that this was the beginning of the end. In the evening of 15th of January, he travelled to Berlin and, apart from one visit to the front, never left the German capital again. The Great Russian Offensive stretched from Baranov to the north of Warsaw and was opposed by exhausted, groggy German units. The army group commanders and chiefs of the General Staff advised Hitler to have his forces fall back to allow a versatile response, but Hitler would not hear of this. He insisted vociferously that the front hold firm and, as so often before, that no ground be yielded. This left our divisions in a desperate situation and frustrated any hopes of an organised defence. Some commanders took it upon themselves to arrange their men as the situation demanded, but Hitler soon detected this sort of independent spirit and removed the offenders. On 15th January, Harp, CNC Army Group Centre, gave way to Schörner. On the 26th, Rendulic replaced Reinhardt, and on the 30th, Hossbach stood aside in favour of Müller. Hossbach was a victim of the party demagogues. The Gauleiter of East Prussia, Kolk, sent to Berlin such scornful reports about Hossbach's leadership that Hitler felt obliged to sacrifice him. In these first weeks of 1945, the military command was in crisis. Hitler stuck to his old principle, which may have been justified in the winter of 1941 but not now, not to surrender a single square metre. The superiority of the Russians along the entire front was so great, however, that no general could stand up to the steamroller and survive. The entire population of East Prussia had taken flight. The highways were blocked with refugees who obstructed the passage of army vehicles. It was almost impossible to cross the Vistula into the Reich proper, and the Russians forced the civilians to the Baltic coast, where their only hope was evacuation by the Kriegsmarine. The Soviets crushed many such treks. Civilian sufferings were unimaginable, and the casualty figure enormous. At the end of January, the Russian southern front forged onwards from southwest of Breslau to the Oder. The consequence of this advance was the loss of the Silesian industrial area. The city of Breslau was encircled but held out with heavy losses until the general capitulation on 6th of May. To halt the Russian advance in the centre, Hitler formed a new army group, Weichsel, commanded by Himmler. It was a ragbag of stragglers and retreating units used as a stopgap to gain time and, needless to say, was viewed with scepticism by military experts. When the Russians reached the Oder, they halted along a line south of Köstrin-Frankfurt an der Oder and along the Neisse to near Görlitz, while Zhukov attempted to shorten his lines of supply to the rear. In the west, at New Year, Anglo-American forces were hoping to beat the Russians to Berlin, and that they failed was due to the strong discipline of the German divisions. Their fate was inevitable, and bitter resistance replaced hopelessness. In January, I travelled again to the Harz, to Ohrdruf in Thuringia. This was a military exercise area where a new FHQ was under construction. The works were proceeding only slowly. I could not see any point in having them speeded up. The great subterranean factory not far from Nordhausen, in which concentration camp inmates helped manufacture large numbers of V-2 rockets, interested me more. The prisoners seemed well treated and were in good physical condition so far as I could determine, but it was nevertheless a depressing sight to watch this forced labour workforce, who hoped to purchase their lives by their industry, at work in the extensive underground galleries. In the CE final analysis, it all seemed rather pointless by this stage. On 30th of January, Hitler broadcast to the German people for the last time. What else could he ask for than a fight to the last? "We will survive even this crisis," he said. "In this battle, it is not Inner Asia that will triumph, but Europe." Many of his listeners still clutched at the straw of the miracle weapons which would turn the tide at the last minute. A few days later, we received the first reports of the meeting on 4th February of Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin at Yalta, which discussed the carving up of the Reich. Hitler was informed about this conference, but was still curiously disinterested, rather as if it had nothing to do with him anymore. On 13 and 14th February, the United States Army Air Forces and Royal Air Force made 2 appalling air raids on Dresden. It was not thought at the time that undefended cities overflowing with refugees would be a target for a mass raid of this kind. This was sheer terrorism, devoid of any military sense against a defenceless civilian population. The devastation exceeded anything that a German city had suffered previously. More than 12,000 buildings and 80,000 homes were destroyed. The beautiful old city was lost forever. The death toll was put at between 135,000 and 300,000. The exact number was unknown because of the huge number of refugees. It was astonishing how the rescue services managed to continue functioning. With these final heavy air raids on Dresden, the German people understood at last the mentality of the Western Allies. After Dresden, Hitler said frequently that he was going to renounce the Geneva Conventions, but Jodl always managed to dissuade him from this step. Hitler summoned the Gau and Reichsleiters to the Chancellery on 24th February. Muchmann, Gauleiter of Dresden, was bombarded with questions about the fate of the city. The Gauleiter for the Rhineland was also at the centre of attention and spoke of the fighting in the west. Gauleiter Koch of East Prussia did not appear. His Gau was almost completely encircled by the Russians. Hanke was holed up in beleaguered Breslau. Hitler came in for criticism, but when he entered the room, stooped and older looking than his visitors had seen him previously, he received a sympathetic reception. His speech began with reflections on the Weimar period and the first years after the seizure of power. Finally, he came to what his audience was waiting for, the present. He spoke of the decisive hours of this war. The year 1945 would decide the next 100 years. His references to new naval and Luftwaffe weapons made no impression. During lunch, Hitler, forced into the Chancellery and death's hands, attempted to convince his listeners that he alone could correctly judge the situation. But the powers of suggestion he had employed in the past to mesmerize this circle were gone. It was at this meeting that he said, "We have liquidated the class warriors of the left, but unfortunately we forgot to strike out against those of the right. That was our great sin of omission." During February, Hitler entertained the fighter pilot Hajo Hermann, who was of the opinion that the time had come for ramming, and suggested to Hitler how this should be done. Yet Hitler still showed no interest in this suicidal method, and spoke of the new fighters, which would shortly bring in new fighter tactics. He also mentioned Goering's plan to form the first jet fighter squadron in southern Germany. He expected great things of these pilots. The formation of this squadron, achieved despite severe difficulties, was the result of the long internal squabbling, which had culminated in the abysmal Areopag. Under the command of General-Lieutenant Galland, the squadron had the best-known and highly decorated fighter pilots of the Luftwaffe: Lützow, Steinhoff, Hohagen, Krupinski, Barkhorn, Baer, Herget, Bob and Eichelstreiber. Operations were limited to a sphere centred on Riem near Munich, and the great successes expected by Hitler failed to materialize. Lützow did not return from one of its missions, and Steinhoff was badly wounded. Since 16th of January, the daily situation conferences in the new Reich Chancellery, when opened in 1939, a superlative edifice of mosaic and marble, now began at 3 in Hitler's large study there, the large room in the old Chancellery, which had been the venue since the beginning of the war, having serious bomb damage. The Army General Staff was at Zossen, south of Berlin, from where Guderian regularly made the journey to report on the rapidly approaching Eastern Front. The circle attending these conferences had grown larger. Bormann and Himmler were always present, and Ribbentrop and the Chief of Police, Kaltenbrunner, frequently. The conferences lasted for 2 to 3 hours, and gave Hitler the opportunity to ruminate at length on the precarious situation. The result would be a shuffle of forces which might be scarcely battle-worthy, if not imaginary, and his ideas did not often reflect the true situation. The most painful reports were those concerning the enemy air raids. The British and Americans flew over the Western Reich more or less as they pleased, bombing residential areas and attacking the supply organisation, the armaments industry or hydrogen works. They were apparently in possession of the most accurate information about factories. These attacks crippled the production of all kinds of war materials. During March, Würzburg and Nordhausen were reduced to rubble, and Halberstadt on the 8th of April. After the daily situation conference, Hitler often took tea with his secretaries in a small office of the old Chancellery. I was occasionally drawn into this circle. Hitler would discuss subjects unconnected with the war as a diversion. On one of these breaks, he suddenly decided to dictate my wife a letter, which she has kept, recalling our frequent meetings. At about this time, Speer went his own way. He knew that defeat was only a few weeks off. He was on the friendliest terms with Guderian, and, escorted by his army liaison officer, Oberstleutnant von Poser, travelled far and wide throughout the Reich, consulting Gauleiters and military commanders on ways to mitigate the order to destroy essential installations. In this way, and at no small personal risk to himself, Speer was able to save many important facilities from destruction. After 15th of March, he presented to Hitler his final report. The Industrial Situation March-April 1945 and its Consequences, which consisted of 10 typewritten pages without appendices setting out the situation clearly and frankly, and the implications he drew from it. Although Speer's reports contained only bad news, Hitler would always take them to his bunker to read when alone. Speer stated in this report that we should do everything to enable the people, if only in the most primitive way, to maintain a basic standard of life. And he continued, "We have no right at this stage of the war to ourselves inflict destruction to the detriment of the German people. We have the duty to leave behind us the possibility to start a reconstruction in the more distant future." Hitler allowed Speer more rope than anybody else to say such things. In better times, they had worked so closely together that Speer was probably the only person who could go so far with Hitler without being in fear of his life. On 15th of February, Hitler went to the front for the last time. Near Frankfurt an der Oder, he visited army units and General Buss's 9th Army Staff. He had collected himself, disguised his injured arm, and made a good impression. But the more discerning amongst his listeners no longer believed what he had to say. It was patently obvious that they had to hold the Oder, and just as certainly they knew that because of the enemy's clear-cut superiority, it was going to be almost impossible to stop the Russian juggernaut once it really got underway. Hitler considered this visit to the front especially important, and believed he had bolstered the troops' confidence. On 19th March, he issued an order to all military commanders, his official answer to Speer's last memorandum. In this so-called Nero order, Hitler ordered that all military communications, signals, industrial and supply installations, as well as ancillary works within the Reich, which might be of use in any way to the enemy immediately, or in the foreseeable future, were to be destroyed. It was not really possible to put this order into effect, since the scale of destruction was already enormous enough without having to introduce a scorched earth policy. Events picked up at the end of March. The Americans had evidently decided to steal a march on the Russians. On 22nd of March, they crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim, and on the 24th at Wesel. The Ruhr was taken within the next few days. Model's army group became encircled, and after its determined resistance ceased on 17th, April Model took his own life. The Americans advanced eastwards in numbers, finding only patchy resistance, and on 11th to 12th April they reached the Elbe at Magdeburg. British forces north of the Americans found only weak resistance on their way through Westphalia, and had little difficulty in getting to Bremen and Hamburg. We gained an impression from the reports that the population in the Reich, especially in northwest Germany, accepted the Allies with relief. They had simply had enough. We understood this, but Hitler could not. He sharply criticised their attitude, but could no longer influence events in Western Germany. Hitler's last goal was to hold off the Russians' onslaught and prevent their crossing the Oder. Himmler was replaced as CNC Army Group Weichsel on 20 March by Generaloberst Heinrizi. Himmler had come in for severe criticism from Hitler, where he had needed to find fault with him, and there was little of a positive nature to say. Hitler had not spared Himmler's blushes. Finally, he had decided to shed the military amateurs. Whether he knew anything at this time of Himmler's feelers to Sweden about an armistice or peace treaty, an act completely contrary to the SS motto "Meine Ehre heißt Treue," I cannot say, but I do not discount it. In any case, the relationship worsened appreciably from the end of March. On the 29th March, Hitler got rid of Guderian after several violent confrontations. Outwardly, the dismissal was couched in terms of obligatory leave, initially for 6 weeks, but the break was final. In past weeks, numerous arguments had arisen as a result of the very reasonable proposals Guderian had made, and to which Hitler preferred to close his mind. The fact that Guderian remained on good terms with Hitler may have been due in part to a misunderstanding as to how his dismissal had come about. He thought he had been forced out by other interests. His successor was Krebs, in whom Hitler had great confidence and whom he had long esteemed both for his personality and as a qualified general staff officer. He had first come to Hitler's notice in the spring of 1941 in the odd scene enacted at the Moscow railway terminus on the occasion of the departure of the Japanese foreign minister, when Stalin had engaged Krebs in a demonstrative conversation. As the last chief of the Army General Staff, Krebs had less work to do than the commander of Berlin Wehrkreis III. He committed suicide in despair after his first meetings post-war with the Red Army when he saw the type of people they were. That same day, Hitler also parted company with his long-serving press chief Dietrich. The relationship between them had recently deteriorated. Goebbels had never trusted his subordinate, and he merely put up with Dietrich because Hitler wanted to keep him. At last, probably with Bormann's support, Bormann and Dietrich rarely spoke, Goebbels got his way, and Dietrich had to go.